Greetings, everyone, to a brief introduction to IFS, also known as internal family systems. So, this is just a very general overview to give you some background into some of the key concepts. You hear me talking about it quite a bit. There are quite a lot of practitioners that I know using it, even if they haven't done training, because the concepts are very universal. And as we develop with the concepts around the language of consciousness and the fractal universe of everything, you may find drawing back on to some of these key themes will give you a good understanding of how some of this goes beyond a therapeutic setting with the one-to-one person. So it was developed by a psychotherapist called Dr. Richard Schwartz, or Dick Schwartz, and he roughly developed the modality because he was working with a lot of people with eating disorders and self-harming issues. And the concept of the parts and the parts that were soothing the system and deployed to do that became something that was very big for him. And he learned a lot from working with a set of clients around this and seeing how the part would manifest in a different way if he asked it to stop, things like that. And he has now admitted to some students, some high-level students, that he's kind of channeled this modality. And that might sound a bit weird, but when you look into some of the discussions I have later on the language of consciousness, you can see how he's tapped into or being tapped into a fractal system. So this modality in itself has a lot of keys. And if we can help people to understand, or we as therapists or practitioners can understand some of this, it really helps us. Okay, so it's evidence-based, which is great. And it works again on subpersonalities known as parts. So we touched upon subpersonalities earlier, and we're going to be talking about some of the particular parts you might find in somebody's system when doing an IFS session. And it will help you to also see how you're working if you're in a one-to-one doing quantum transfiguration with a person, or if you can see that some parts are dominating and you need to have an intervention with them. So one of the main concepts that we're going to be touching upon, which is like a governing principle in how to hold good space in IFS, is the concept of self-energy. And in many ways, as you'll see later, it lines up a little bit with what we might think of as Buddha nature. And we can talk all that we like about self-energy, but the reason IFS exists is because a lot of the time we're not in self-energy. And that means that a part is dominating. So that's one of the fundamental precepts is, or premises, is that we're in a part when we're not exuding this compassionate, calm, considerate vibration. And this is where we start to unearth what the parts are doing and start to find out why they have that persona, because it's not self-energy, and they've been brought in through some sort of wound or trauma. And this is the job of IFS, is to find out more about these subpersonalities and to help them. And IFS language, IFS as understanding that we have these subpersonalities that sometimes overdominate, we can be called blended with these parts, is a great way of us suddenly becoming less polarized with our own shadow aspects or traumatized parts, and also with those of others. So we have a lot of conflict on the planet because of dualism, of the other as a perpetrator, the other as a bad guy, the other as whatever. And when we start to realize, actually, I'm not in self-energy because I've got a reaction that's pretty much not a Buddha reaction here, I'm really triggered. That means there's a part. Okay, so once we can start to think, and realize that we are sometimes dominated by parts, we can speak for the parts and honor them and say, a part of me is feeling really anxious about going on that long trip with you when you don't have a driving license. Okay, something like that. And when we start to talk from our parts, we're creating space that's also, I see I have a part and I need to work on that. And we're also showing the person that we're talking to that we realize that, and that we're fallible or human or wounded, or we have an affliction, depending on what language you might be wanting to apply. And we're also giving them the opportunity to come into a similar arena, which is not so much about finger pointing, you did this. And, you know, as many elders say, you know, when you point the finger, what is really pointing back at you? Many fingers. So this is something that can really help in a form of nonviolent communication and in facilitation and mediations with people, so that as a tool for many other things, it can be really helpful. So it's a very useful concept to apply, and you may find it comes in well for you when you're working with people with quantum transfiguration, because you may sense parts. You might have a part that's it's your first time working with a client and you're absolutely terrified, but it's not you who's terrified. You did the qualification for a reason. There's a part of you that's probably really worried because it reminds you of when you gave a talk at school when you were 8 and you got laughed at by one person, something like that. Okay, so having mindfulness around them and mindfulness around other people's parts, because they may be having a barrier to receiving whatever modality it is that you're offering, because there's a part that's skeptical or cynical. And if we can help them to realize it's a part, we can often get the larger part of them online. So some main principles that we want to tune into with IFS and this parts work that are really, really crucial to understand are that we have what's called a system. So we're like this giant super company with all these assembly lines and departments. And of course, a lot of these link up to parts of the body as well. And our giant company has all these parts doing these jobs. And if you can imagine a company where the management went on holiday and forgot to come back, it's kind of a little bit like that. So a lot of the machinery's outmoded. Nobody's got the right sort of newest management style techniques or software or systems to help the major system to run more efficiently. So everything's kind of old and clunky and everybody's knackered and there's dust on the machines and this sort of thing. And these parts are knackered. And this is a really important thing for us to understand. All the parts in our system, they're working. They all got brought in for a reason. And it's usually to help an exiled part. This was one of the parts that got stuck when we got wounded. And usually a cluster or one part come to defend around that exiled part, because there's a fear. Oh my goodness, remember what happened the last time we were able to go to school for 6 weeks and it was a bit weird and awful. And so the system has deployed, or the exile has, we can find out these other parts to protect or soothe around the system as a way of really preventing us from actually healing. And that's why we suddenly sometimes realize everything in us is running to a standstill. We're triggered by everything because we've basically got all these conflicts going on. And these parts are there really trying to avert us from getting to the wounded part because they don't want it to get hurt. But inevitably, we have to excavate and get that hurt part out in order for everything to be okay, right? So often we're blended with the parts, and it can be like, oh, there's the part that overeats, or there's the part that drinks too much vodka, this sort of thing. So sometimes we have shame, and that's a shameful part. It's not the Buddha nature, it's not the self energy. So we can have a series of reactionary parts to one protective endeavor by one part, and some parts are not friends because the way they deliver their protection and safeguarding of the exile part may be different. So they clash. And that, again, our system is 1 minute we go and we love to dance wildly. And then the next day there's the part that you always make a fool of yourself when you do that. And then the shame kicks in, and then those two hate each other. And so every time there's I want to let my hair down, there's this fight. Okay. So many of them have been there a very, very long time. And they don't know that. Okay. So many of them got drafted in 3 years old, some of them before that. And as we develop, we find out how different parts ended up there. And some of them may have been there because a family member had it, all of these sorts of things. So as I said earlier, some of them soothe, some of them protect, but they're all essentially trying to help this exile. Parts can be felt often in the body. So sometimes people will come to me because there's something really wonky in their body, and they know there's a metaphysical aspect to it, that there's something that the body's trying to say, and it's manifested this part or this pain because there's something emotional that has happened that they can't remember or can't quite identify. So often we find parts around the body. They can be tightnesses, wounds. Sometimes before a session, some pains will come up in the client. And also sometimes they're very head-based because they're controlling parts, and they may be very much about figuring out things and preempting and trying to keep a very tightly run ship so that nothing can go wrong. So you can imagine how much processing memory that's taking up. And this is the sort of part that we're really thinking about when you're doing things like a quantum transfiguration session, because sometimes you'll have people figuring out parts, trying to run the show, and they're not able to surrender into the process. And so the best thing we can do is understand this, because then we can get them on board. Okay. So I wouldn't encourage any of you, if you haven't done a qualification in IFS, to start doing a whole session in IFS. But knowing how parts work and interacting with parts can be okay. I do have to say, sometimes if you meet a part and you've made contact and you're discussing things with it, and then you go away, it can actually get worse in terms of its manifestation of protecting or soothing or whatever it's doing in the system, because it's almost like we've said we're going to help in some way and then we don't come back. Okay, so it's really important that you understand these subpersonalities are like people. Some people will see colors, some people get sensation, some people see bits of nature, some people see distinct personas, and some people see themselves at different ages, and sometimes it could be people that they knew who are representing a certain role, and sometimes it's just an essence that can iterate, and sometimes they're pre-verbal parts, so we work with them in a different way. So what we're essentially doing is trying to make friends with the parts. And this is, the self energy is crucial in this. And we're wanting to find out more about the part. Now, if you remember that this is this giant super company, all the cobwebs, people often are like, and who are you? Why are you here? Because they don't trust. The managers went on a permanent holiday, the grown-up man, the big manager. So you can imagine how long somebody's inner child is being protected by these parts. Often there's a lot of mistrust. They're like, yeah, and you just think you turn up. So this is why finding out about the parts and having genuine interest, and it has to be genuine. If it's made up, the system can tell. So basically it's about making friends and then actually delivering the goods by helping the overburdened parts to release their burdens, and also where needed to call in supportive values. And this is ultimately with the goal to do similar for the exile part, but hopefully for the exile part to be free, and for all the parts to be free or re-rolled into something that's much more fun for them, much more fluid for the system. And sometimes that means that the parts want to go to Botlands or a crazy holiday camp that I'd never be seen dead in. And sometimes they want to go and read a book, and sometimes they want to go into the heart. It's their choice. And this is the important thing. They are distinct personalities. it's not the person speaking for them. And we have a tendency often to do that because we're like, oh yeah, I've worked out, I've seen how this all works. And we start to speak for the part. So there's a lot of trust making to achieve. And then, of course, after that, we integrate it because there's a big change to the system. When things get shuffled, as we are more understanding now of multidimensionality, as things reshuffle, our neural pathways also reshuffle, but our quantum field shuffles. And after a session, we often aren't able to think much, to figure things out. And sometimes there's a very big sense of loss, sometimes even, because sometimes even though it might not have been doing us good, we've had that manager there since we were 3. And sometimes we wake up the next day and we're like, wow, that's not there anymore. And just integrating that can be something, especially when we're dealing with parts that have had more severity on the person's well-being in a bigger scheme. So, as I said earlier, self-energy, kind of like Buddha nature, and C's are a very good way of understanding it. So you can read the slide here. We've got creativity, compassion, curiosity, connection, clarity, courage, calmness, confidence. We, the space holder, the therapist, whatever we are, practitioner, our job is to be the beacon of self-energy. Because what happens, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes a person's very triggered. And therefore, they meet a part that might have been doing something that would seem destructive to a preconceived notion of what is healthy. And sometimes we will find out that the person is quite blended or very antagonistic. They have an angry part at that part, and there's a lot to dismantle, and they don't have enough self-energy towards the part themselves. Or sometimes they're dissociating so much that they can't stay present. So our job is to boost self-energy and to stay in that. And it's very important that we are in that when we go into a session and we can hold that. So it's very interesting because when I was doing my training, I noticed that if I did quite a lot of IFS, well, we were doing our training, and sometimes at night we were supposed to maybe we would do some IFS at nights with our team, but also sometimes we'd have some emails to catch up with that were business related. And we'd been spending all day in self-energy, and I would be like, I can't do that. I can't do my admin. And I was speaking to one of my tutors who was like a barrister or QC. And he said, yeah, I have days I do IFS, because he's having to deal with all these legal matters as a highly esteemed lawyer. And there's no way he could do that because he's self-energy. He's not in that critical thinking mindset. So it's really interesting. Self-energy is a beautiful thing to have, and it's beautiful to work with it with clients and to cultivate it for sessions, because I have found it very useful. I'm making this transmission at the COVID time, and it's been great because I've been asked to do quite a lot of sessions recently, and I've been grateful because it's giving me a chance and an excuse to be in self-energy around a lot of craziness. And just being in self-energy for that hour with someone helps me to stay in a more thought-free, less obscured fashion, where I'm not so dominated by trivial stuff. Okay, so there are bonuses to cultivating self-energy, where you're holding space for somebody else, but then you can stay in that field for quite a long time afterwards on the day. And this is something that I encourage you all to do, whether or not you're doing IFS, is to just note, okay, I got really triggered there. That's not me, that's a part. Once you start to do that, you're starting to create a distance to map your own parts and to map your fractal, which is so important as we do quantum work. And when you start to say, oh, that was not really self-energy speaking there, you will be able to start to slow down the cycles and to rewire your own brain. Because once you have mindfulness over something and you can observe it, you're creating a shift in your timeline where you can start to rewire and create a new neural pathway that is more positive and less obscured and less full of afflictions, as we'd say in Buddhism. So this is why also understanding about this is really helpful for you as you go into this training, because you can start to work with people and work out when you have parts. Now, later on, we will be discussing how parts and patterns are different and how these things can work in your system. But once you find parts, there usually is a fractal component. Sometimes it's actually in somebody's timeline in past life or in their family line. And this is for you to look into. This is one of the reasons that I am talking about IFS, because there are so many fractal components of it that if you get your head around this, you're going to suddenly understand the universe in a more macro way. So some of the parts that we might see in a system. Now, I just want to say, as I said at the bottom, don't get preoccupied with the labels. It doesn't matter. You don't have to say that is a manager part and that is a firefighter and tell your client. It can be helpful. Sometimes it's very easy to say, okay, they've got that soothing part, because you might find soothing parts and protector parts don't get on. So sometimes you would know, I need to maybe look to see if there's a protector here, because you won't be able to work fully until you engage with all of them. So in theory, managers are the protector parts. So they could be like big security guards. They're very guarded. The firefighters are the ones that might bring out mountains of ice cream or chocolate or swearing or something, or going to the gym for disproportionate amounts of time every day, because rather than look at a pain, somebody will work out to go through it, or not even go through it, but just to go into not looking, okay? And then the exile is the wounded part. Now, as we develop, and this is very pertinent to quantum work, sometimes we find parts that are older than, oh, I fell off my bike when I was 5, sort of parts. And these sometimes are ones that have come in from our ancestors, and these are called legacy burdens, and we have a specific way of working with them. And in the second level of quantum transfiguration, we will be doing deeper work at working with ancestors and legacy burdens. But it's useful to know they are there, because if we're always just looking at somebody's system, protectors, firefighters, we may miss something out. And at the moment, because of the times we're in, a lot of people come in, they know that they're here to work for their ancestors. A lot of us attract the weirdos, the black sheep, and the black sheep people are usually the ones who've actually never been understood, because their job is going to be more multidimensional in the family, and they're the ones who often need to acknowledge and clear. They see a lot of the afflictions. They don't feel quite like they belong to the obscurities, the obscurations the family has carried. And they have to work with that bittersweet medicine. And sometimes we also have unattached burdens, and these can be parts that have come in sometimes through non-organic ways. And sometimes this can be just through transference in a session where we've done a lot of clearing, and then we're like, oh, I don't feel very aligned afterwards when the client leaves, because we maybe picked something up, or some part has got deflected. And we're able to let those parts go because they're not part of our system. So there's actually a protocol to deal with that. As I said earlier, the fundamental positive outcome, we don't have attachment to outcomes in the same way as in some modalities. Holding self-energy and just letting it roll is enough. And Dr. Richard Schwartz, he has such amazing self-energy that people just unburden immediately, because he's cultivated that. And a lot of us who've worked with a lot of meditation or plant medicines find we're able to cultivate self-energy quite well. And usually we can get a dialogue with people's parts quite easily, but that's not always the case. And it's really important for a therapist not to have attachment to, they're going to unblend in the first session. And sometimes the part won't unblend because there's still things to find out. And this is especially true when there's legacy burdens around. Sometimes there's a hesitancy in the system because sometimes there's still a message to be shared. And if we're not, if we're only working with the head in IFS, we might not pick up on these things. But this is why working with quantum modalities, our body sometimes is saying there's something else, or can feel a difference. So I'm able to follow my body as a cue to often ask, okay, so is that from your system? Things that maybe, in fact, I got taught to do it. Our year got taught these things, which were level 2 at level 1. And I was really grateful because this is the sort of work I do. So it didn't mean that I had to pursue the qualifications because I got what I needed. And so a lot of you will come in and just into your therapies these days, knowing that you're going to be working a lot with ancestors. So it's just good to know this exists. So one thing I was mentioning earlier is that the client can be triggered, but what about the therapist? So it's important for us to also unblend if we get in an altercation on the road on the way into work and we've got road rage. Okay, so we have to mark it, identify, and place that part in an area where we can look at it later, but where it doesn't dominate our session. So this is really, really important. And this can also happen when a client comes in and they've identified some parts, and then they start to work out how this all happened when I was this age and this. And it's very helpful in a way, but it's a figuring out part. And we often have to work with that, especially because we're in the Western kind of world, the developed world, where people are recovering from colonization and the archetypes they're in. So there's quite a domineering, slightly perpetrator part that tries to figure things out because it's trying to think ahead. It's like a chess game, you know. So that's not bit of nature. There's still an aspect of duality, and ultimately the system is looking, where's the conflict? Okay, so it's really important that we map those things, and we map them in ourselves, and we map them in a client. And this is a sort of thing that can be very useful when doing quantum modalities as well, because you may find somebody so blended with something they can't sink into receiving and working with the energies of the field. And so sometimes you can just ask them, could you just ask that part to step aside a little bit? And you can let it watch. It's allowed to watch. But and often they won't step aside unless they know they can see. Okay, so you want to just make sure that you can help a client to receive as much as possible. And sometimes that's just gently asking that to happen, and it will do it as long as you're nice about it. Finally, with this one, this is a biggie, and this is where, again, our figuring out part, our elation at this thing having been found out, suddenly is like, yes, I want to pack them off to a luxury holiday to Barbados, and they've decided where the part wants to go. And we sometimes have to ascertain, is that the part speaking? Because the part of the subpersonality is what we are focusing on. We're not in a one-to-one. Each IFS session, the star of the show is the parts in the system. And so it's very important, especially when we have these legacies of these kind of colonizers. Our colonizer parts can sometimes be trying to decide what our parts in the system that are the ones we're trying to get to want to do. So you need to look at that as well. So how does IFS connect with quantum transfiguration? So I've already talked about quite a few things here. And I mentioned earlier that if a client or student is skeptical or blended with a part, we can help them explore this. And also, just this thing about us being triggered or them being triggered, move it on, because we can identify the part and move on and get it to step to the side. And also this fact that we're doing so much ancestral work that sometimes finding these legacy burdens and understanding a little bit about how we would work with those and apply it to a quantum transfiguration setting, it works very seamlessly and it's very dignified. And we will talk about that obviously in a practical session. And you will have seen me a little bit in some of the demos as well doing that. And as I've said, this aspect of being and self energy, it's great just to do it as much as possible. It's not just that it might make a person not be able to do their admin one afternoon and be able to cope with the general murkiness of the field during coronavirus pandemic times. There's also something that's really important here. And this would line up with fundamentals of Tibetan Buddhism as well. And it's about retraining the mind. The longer we spend in a more Zen-like state, and in a state that's not overthinking everything and running in crazy loops, the more we are opting out of samsaric existence, because we're not looping, we're not stuck in the same karmic loops. And this is a key. So you have nothing to lose if you decide to sit in these states for longer, because eventually, this is my little thinking on this, is that system will override the others, because it will become more and more second nature as you re-educate your system to lapse into that. So this is why doing sessions with people, quantum sessions, IFS, etc., are great, because you're also, on top of maybe doing daily practice, being a professional and getting paid to be training your brain to be more Buddha-like. How about that? So yeah, you can do this amazing thing and just become a higher being, more from the heart and more from authenticity and compassion, and just suddenly lapse into that state of being, I hope. Okay, so that's that. I hope you enjoyed this. And yeah, I'd forgotten how many slides I'd done because I'd gone so into the zone. So I hope some of the zone has transferred nicely to you. And I look forward to the next sharings. Take care, everybody. Ciao, ciao.